They say silence is golden, but in my house it felt more like lead. It had been 3 months since the funeral, and the silence had settled into the floorboards and the velvet curtains like a heavy dust that I could not sweep away no matter how hard I tried. My name is Clementine Prescott, but Felix always called me Cleo. He said Clementine was too much of a mouthful for a woman who never wasted words. I was 72 years old, and I had spent 40 of those years ensuring that every book in the city library was cataloged and preserved and respected. I knew where things belonged. I knew that order was the only thing keeping chaos at bay. But Felix was gone, and my order was unraveling. I was sitting in the sunroom drinking a cup of Earl Grey that had gone cold when I heard the mail slot clatter in the front hallway. It was a sharp metallic sound that made me jump. I wasn't expecting anything. The bills were paid. The sympathy cards had finally stopped coming, which was a relief because I was running out of polite ways to thank people for reminding me that I was alone. I walked down the hallway, and the floorboards creaked under my slippers. I bent down to pick up the single envelope lying on the rug. It was thick and creamy and expensive. It had no return address, just my name typed in a severe black font. Clementine Prescott. I opened it right there in the hallway. I didn't even use a letter opener, which Felix would have teased me about. He always said a sharp mind deserved sharp tools. Inside was a single sheet of legal paper and a photocopy of a document. I read the letter first. It was brief and cruel. It informed me that Mr. Desmond Galloway was exercising his right to foreclose on the property at 42 Willow Creek Lane due to unpaid debts incurred by the late Felix Prescott. It said I had 30 days to vacate the premises. My knees felt weak, and I had to reach out and steady myself against the hallway table. Desmond Galloway. I knew the name. He was a man Felix had done business with occasionally. A flashy man who wore suits that were too shiny and smiled with too many teeth. Felix had never liked him. He called him a vulture in a silk tie. I looked at the photocopy attached to the letter. It was a loan agreement dated 6 months ago. It stated that Felix had borrowed a significant sum of money and had put our house up as collateral. And at the bottom of the page was Felix's signature. I stared at that signature for a long time. The ink looked black even in the photocopy. The loops in the slant seemed familiar. To anyone else, it would look exactly like Felix signed it. But I was not anyone else. I was an archivist. I had spent my life studying handwriting and spotting forgeries in historical documents. I knew how a hand hesitated when it was lying. I took the paper into Felix's study. I turned on his desk lamp, and I pulled my magnifying glass out of the drawer. My hands were shaking, but my mind was suddenly cold and clear. I placed the photocopy under the light. I looked at the capital F in Felix. My husband had a tremor in his right hand during the last year of his life. It was a slight thing, and barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It made the cross of his F slightly jagged, but this signature was smooth. It was confident. It was the signature of a younger man or a man pretending to be Felix without knowing the secrets of his aging body. I looked closer at the date. 6 months ago, Felix was in the hospital recovering from pneumonia. He couldn't even lift a spoon, let alone sign a complex loan agreement. Desmond Galloway was lying. He was trying to steal my home. He thought because I was an old widow living alone, that I would simply pack my bags and fade away into a retirement home. He thought I was weak. I set the magnifying glass down. I could feel a fire starting in my chest, a heat that burned away the grief and the silence. I wasn't just sad anymore. I was angry. And as I looked around the room at the thousands of books Felix and I had collected over a lifetime, I realized that Desmond had made a terrible mistake. He had picked a fight with a woman who remembered everything. The doorbell rang 2 days later, and it sounded like a summons to court. I knew it was him before I even opened the heavy oak door. The air outside was damp and gray, the kind of weather that makes your joints ache and your mood sour. When I pulled the door open, Desmond Galloway was standing on my porch shaking a wet umbrella. He was a tall man who carried himself with the forced casualness of a politician. He wore a navy suit that was tailored a little too tightly, and his cologne was thick and musky. It smelled like expensive leather and ambition. He smiled when he saw me, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were cold and scanning the hallway behind me before he even said hello. "Hello, Cleo," he said, and his voice was smooth like oil on water. "I am so sorry to intrude on you like this. I know this is a difficult time." I didn't invite him in, but he stepped forward anyway, forcing me to back up. I felt small in his presence, which I suspected was exactly how he wanted me to feel. I decided right then to play the part he expected. I hunched my shoulders slightly and let my hands tremble as I clasped them in front of my cardigan. "I don't understand, Mr. Galloway," I said, keeping my voice thin and wavering. "Felix never told me about a loan. We own this house, free and clear. My father built it." Desmond sighed a long theatrical sigh of pity. He walked past me into the living room, and I watched him carefully. A man who has just acquired a house usually looks at the ceiling to check for leaks, or looks at the floors to check for rot. Desmond didn't look at the house. He looked at the walls. Specifically, he looked at the bookshelves that lined every inch of the living room. "Felix was a proud man, Cleo," he said, turning to face me. "He didn't want to worry you with his financial troubles. But business is business. I want to be fair to you. I can give you a few weeks to pack your personal items, clothes and photos." He paused and walked over to the mahogany shelf, running his finger along the spine of a first edition Dickens. I held my breath. However, he continued, turning back to me. "I know moving all these heavy books and boxes of old papers would be a burden for a woman of your age. I would be happy to include the contents of the study and the library in the foreclosure. I can hire a crew to clean it all out for you so you don't have to lift a finger." The trap snapped shut, and suddenly everything made sense. He didn't want the house. The house was just the wrapper. He wanted what was inside. He wanted the archives. Felix had hinted once about a project he was working on, a historical curiosity involving the Blackwood family who had founded our town. I hadn't paid much attention at the time, but Felix had been obsessed. "I see," I said, lowering my eyes to hide the spark of realization. "That is very generous of you, Desmond. I suppose I don't have much use for dusty old paper anymore." He relaxed. His shoulders dropped an inch and a genuine smile flickered on his face. He thought he had won. He thought I was just another confused old woman surrendering to the inevitable. "Excellent," he said, checking his gold watch. "I will have my lawyers draw up the final papers. You just worry about your clothes. Leave the books to me." He left 10 minutes later. As soon as his car disappeared down the driveway, I dropped the act. I straightened my back and marched into Felix's study. I needed to find it before Desmond's movers arrived. I went to the bottom shelf behind the rolling ladder. There, tucked between a history of maritime law and a collection of maps, was a small, unassuming book bound in cracked black leather. The Blackwood Ledger. To the untrained eye, it looked like a boring diary of a 19th century grocer. But Felix had told me it was the key to something bigger. I couldn't leave it here, but I couldn't take it with me in my purse in case Desmond had me watched or searched. I needed to hide it in plain sight. I took the ledger to the kitchen. On the counter sat my old copy of The Art of French Cooking. It was a massive book, thick as a brick, and splattered with 20 years of tomato sauce and gravy stains. Years ago, Felix had hollowed out the middle pages to hide emergency cash, but we had long since spent the money. I opened the cookbook to the chapter on soufflés. The center was a hollow square. I placed the Blackwood Ledger inside. It fit perfectly. I closed the cookbook and placed it back on the wire rack next to the flour jar. Desmond Galloway was looking for a library. He would never think to look in a greasy old cookbook in a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and yeast. The city library had always been my sanctuary. It was a cathedral of silence built of granite and glass in the center of town. I walked up the wide stone steps, and I felt a ghost of my old self returning. For 40 years, I had been the keeper of this place. I knew the rhythm of the automatic doors and the specific squeak of the book carts. But today, I was not here to catalog history. I was here to dig up dirt. I walked past the main desk, where a young woman with blue hair was scanning books with a rhythmic beep. She didn't recognize me. I kept my head down and headed straight for the basement level. This was the archives, my old kingdom. The air down here was cooler and smelled of dehumidifiers and decaying paper. It was a smell that most people found musty, but to me, it smelled like truth. I sat down at one of the computer terminals in the back corner. It was an older machine that hummed loudly, but I preferred it because it was connected to the local newspaper digitized database. I needed to know who Desmond Galloway really was. A man doesn't just appear with a forged loan document and a hunger for old books without leaving a trail. I typed his name into the search bar. Desmond Galloway. At first, there was nothing but fluff. Charity galas he had attended. A photo of him shaking hands with the mayor at a ribbon cutting for a new park. He had done a good job of painting himself as a pillar of the community, a benevolent businessman. But I knew how to look deeper. I filtered the search results. I removed the society pages and focused on the legal notices and the business filings. I went back 5 years, then 10, then 20. And there it was. A small article from a defunct county gazette dated 15 years ago. The headline was small and tucked away on page 8. Dispute over rare map collection settled out of court. I leaned in closer, adjusting my glasses. The article detailed a lawsuit involving an elderly collector who claimed he had been swindled out of a Civil War-era atlas. The man accused a broker of undervaluing the item and then reselling it for a fortune overseas. The broker was unnamed in the headline, but in the third paragraph, there he was, a junior associate named Desmond Galloway. I kept digging. I found another mention in a trade journal for antique dealers. This one was more recent. It was a puff piece about high-stakes estate liquidations. Desmond was quoted saying that the true value of history is knowing where to look when no one else is watching. He wasn't a banker. He wasn't a lender. He was a hunter. He was a man who preyed on estates and elderly widows and confused heirs to strip them of assets they didn't know the value of. I sat back in the creaking chair and felt a chill run down my spine. Felix hadn't gone to Desmond for a loan. Felix must have found something. He must have found the Blackwood ledger, and somehow Desmond had heard about it. Desmond must have approached Felix to buy it or steal it, and when Felix refused, Desmond created a debt that didn't exist. My husband hadn't been hiding financial shame from me. He had been protecting me. He had been protecting our home from a predator. I looked at the screen one last time. I memorized the names of the shell companies Desmond used. I memorized the pattern of his operations. He always targeted the vulnerable. He always used the law as a weapon. I printed the pages. The printer whirred and spat out the warm sheets of paper. I folded them neatly and placed them in my purse. I wasn't just fighting for my house anymore. I was fighting for Felix's reputation. Desmond Galloway wanted a war over a book. He had no idea that he had just declared war on the librarian who knew exactly how to read between the lines. Night fell over Willow Creek Lane like a heavy woolen blanket. I had locked every door and double-checked the window latches, but the house still felt exposed. It is a strange feeling to be a stranger in your own home, to feel that the walls you have painted and the floors you have polished are suddenly temporary. I made myself a pot of strong black coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The only light came from the small lamp over the stove, which cast long dancing shadows against the cabinets. I pulled the copy of The Art of French Cooking from the shelf. It felt heavy in my hands. I opened it to the soufflé section and removed the blackwood ledger. In the dim light, the leather cover looked like dried skin. It smelled of mildew and thyme. I placed it on the table next to a notepad and a sharpened pencil. If Desmond Galloway was willing to destroy my life for this book, I needed to know why. I opened the cover. The pages were yellow and brittle, flaking at the edges like dead leaves. The handwriting was cramped and erratic, written in a fading brown ink that looked uncomfortably like dried blood. It was the journal of Jeremiah Blackwood, the patriarch of the family who had founded this town in the 1800s. I started to read. At first, it seemed like the ramblings of a man losing his mind. The entries were nonsensical. The crows are too loud today. I planted the silver spoon in the garden, but the soil rejected it. The north wind brings news of the king, but the king has no face. I frowned. It was gibberish. I turned the page. Wednesday, the river flows uphill. I saw a fish with the eyes of a cat. Do not trust the baker, for his flour is made of bone. I rubbed my temples. Felix had been a smart man, but he was literal. He would have looked at this and seen madness. He would have looked for numbers or maps or clear directions. But I had spent 40 years categorizing the unclassifiable. I knew that in the archives nothing is ever truly random. I stopped reading the words for their meaning and started looking at their structure. I looked at the syntax. I looked at the rhythm of the sentences. It was a habit from my days teaching calligraphy and cipher history to high school students. I noticed something odd about the prepositions. They were awkward. They were placed in spots that interrupted the natural flow of the Victorian dialect. I looked at the first entry again. The crows are too loud today. I planted the silver spoon in the garden. I looked at the second entry. The river flows uphill. I saw a fish with the eyes. I tapped my pencil against the table. It wasn't the prepositions. It was the breaks, the pauses. I looked closer at the ink. The writer had pressed harder on certain letters. It was microscopic, almost invisible to the naked eye, but under the harsh light of the kitchen lamp, I saw it. The downstrokes on specific letters were slightly heavier. I grabbed my notepad. I started transcribing the letters that had the heavy downstrokes. It was tedious work. My eyes watered and my hand cramped, but I didn't stop. I felt a thrill I hadn't felt in years, the thrill of the hunt. I was reaching back through a century and catching a whisper that everyone else had missed. B-E-N-E-A-T-H. The first word took shape on my notepad. Beneath. My heart hammered against my ribs. I kept going faster now. T-H-E-F-L-O-O-R G-O-A-R-D-S. Beneath the floorboards. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. This wasn't a diary of a madman. It was a map. Jeremiah Blackwood hadn't been crazy, he had been paranoid. He had hidden his fortune and written the location in a code that only a meticulous obsessiveness could reveal. I deciphered the rest of the sentence. WHETCHESADWFALLS-ATNOO. I sat back and stared at the paper. Beneath the floorboards where the shadow falls at noon, it was a specific instruction. But which shadow? And which floorboards? I looked up at the kitchen clock. It was 2 in the morning. I had 10 hours until noon. Desmond Galloway thought he had me cornered. He thought he was closing in on a helpless old woman. But he didn't know that the treasure he was looking for was right under my feet. And for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid. I was ready to dig. The morning passed with agonizing slowness. I paced the length of the living room, watching the square of sunlight creep across the Persian rug. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked with a heavy, rhythmic thud that seemed to echo in my chest. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was a countdown. I had deciphered the clue, but now I had to trust the geography of my own home, where the shadow falls at noon. The house faced south, which meant the midday sun flooded the main library through the tall bay windows. If Jeremiah Blackwood had buried his secret 150 years ago, he would have used a permanent marker. A tree might die. A wall might crumble. But the sun always travels the same path. At 11:55, I stood in the center of the library. The air was still and filled with the scent of old paper and lemon polish. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light like tiny suspended stars. I watched the shadow of the window frame. It was a dark cross stretching out over the floorboards. I held my breath as the clock began to chime. 1, 2, 3. The shadow moved imperceptibly, shifting as the sun reached its zenith. On the final chime of noon, the tip of the shadow, the very peak of the window's arch, rested perfectly on a knot in the oak floorboard near the fireplace. It was a dark swirl in the wood that I had looked at 1,000 times and never truly seen. I dropped to my knees. My joints popped, but I didn't care. I pulled back the heavy rug, exposing the bare wood. I ran my fingers over the knot. It felt smooth and cool. I pressed down on it, expecting nothing, but to my shock, the board shifted. It didn't squeak. It pivoted. Someone had oiled this hinge recently. My heart hammered in my throat as I wedged my fingers into the gap and pried the board up. It wasn't a rough hole dug into the earth by a mad pioneer. It was a clean, rectangular space lined with felt, and inside there was no gold. There were no jewels. There was a gray metal fireproof box. I recognized it immediately. It was the lockbox Felix used to keep in his office downtown. He told me he had lost the key years ago and thrown it away. He had lied. I lifted the box out. It was heavy. I set it on the floor and stared at the combination dial. I didn't need to guess. Felix was a creature of habit. I turned the dial left to 19, right to 70, left to 5. The year we were married. The latch clicked with a satisfying snap. I opened the lid. Inside was a thick manila folder labeled simply Galloway. I opened the file, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a ledger of gold. It was a ledger of crimes. There were photographs of Desmond Galloway meeting with known fences in back alleys. There were bank statements showing transfers to offshore accounts. There were detailed notes in Felix's handwriting documenting every illegal artifact Desmond had laundered through legitimate auctions. I read a note clipped to the top. Cleo, if you are reading this, I have failed. Desmond forced me to authenticate a forgery. He threatened to burn down the library if I didn't comply. I am gathering evidence to go to the FBI, but I need one last piece of proof. Keep this safe. Tears pricked my eyes. Felix hadn't been a partner. He had been a hostage. He had been working in the shadows, trying to protect his integrity and his wife from a monster. And he had used the old Blackwood legend, a story he knew Desmond was obsessed with, to hide the one thing that could destroy him. I touched Felix's handwriting. It felt like he was in the room with me. He hadn't left me nothing. He had left me a weapon. Suddenly, the landline phone in the hallway rang. It was a shrill, piercing sound that shattered the moment. I froze. Who would be calling me in the middle of the day? I stood up, clutching the file to my chest, and walked into the hall. I picked up the receiver. Hello? There was a pause. A breathing sound. Then a voice I recognized instantly. Mrs. Prescott, Desmond Galloway said. His voice was no longer smooth. It was tight and agitated. I hope you are packing. I have decided to move up the inspection. My associates will be there in an hour to secure the property. He hung up before I could answer. He knew. Somehow he knew I was getting close. Or maybe he was just impatient. I looked at the file in my arms. I looked at the hole in the floor. I had the truth, but I was an old woman alone in a big house, and the wolves were at the door. I didn't have an hour. I barely had minutes. Desmond's voice had been tight with an urgency that suggested his associates were already turning onto my street. I looked at the manila folder in my arms, the evidence that could put Desmond in prison, and then I looked at the heavy French cookbook on the counter where the Blackwood ledger was hidden. I couldn't take both. If they stopped me, a confused old woman clutching her purse was one thing, but a woman hauling a library of documents was suspicious. The file was the weapon. The ledger was the bait. I made a split-second decision. I shoved Felix's file deep into my oversized knitting tote, burying it under balls of yarn and half-finished scarf. I left the cookbook right where it was, next to the flour jar. I grabbed my keys and slipped out the back door just as the crunch of tires on gravel echoed from the front driveway. I didn't run. Running implies guilt. I walked briskly through the garden, cutting through the hedge to the neighbor's yard, and made my way to the bus stop 3 blocks away. I rode the bus to the grocery store, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I bought milk. I bought bread. I forced myself to make small talk with the cashier about the price of eggs, all while my hands shook so badly I could barely swipe my card. I returned 2 hours later. The black SUV was gone from my driveway. The house looked quiet from the street, but the front door was standing ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. I walked up the steps, clutching my grocery bags as a shield. I pushed the door open and gasped. It wasn't just a search. It was a violation. My home had been gutted. The bookshelves in the living room had been swept clean. Thousands of books dumped onto the floor in a chaotic sea of paper and broken spines. The sofa cushions were slashed open, vomiting white stuffing into the air. Drawers were pulled out and overturned. The air smelled of aggression and stale cigarette smoke. I stepped over the ruins of my life, my shoes crunching on broken glass from the hallway mirror. I went straight to the kitchen. It was a mess. The pantry shelves were cleared, cans of soup rolling on the linoleum. But there, on the counter, amidst a pile of spilled sugar, sat the art of French cooking. It was untouched. To men like Desmond's hired muscle, a stained cookbook was invisible. It was domestic. It was worthless. I let out a sob of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard knot of fear. They hadn't found what they were looking for, which meant they would be back. And next time, they wouldn't wait for me to leave. I couldn't stay here. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. I reached into my tote bag and felt the hard edge of Felix's file. I needed help. I needed someone who wasn't on Desmond's payroll. I drove to a payphone at a gas station on the edge of town. I didn't trust my home line, and I didn't trust my cell phone. I dug a quarter out of my purse and dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah?" "Silas?" I said, my voice cracking. "It's Clementine Prescott, Felix's wife." There was a pause. Silas Thorne was a retired homicide detective who had spent his career chasing the city's worst monsters. He had been a friend of Felix's, a man who played chess with him on Tuesdays before his knees gave out. "Cleo," he said, his tone shifting instantly from suspicion to concern. "I heard about Felix. I'm sorry I missed the service. I was out of town." "I don't need condolences, Silas," I said, watching a police cruiser drive past the gas station, wondering if they were Desmond's men too. "I need protection. Someone broke into my house. They're looking for something Felix hid." "Did you call the cops?" "I can't," I whispered. "The man who did this owns the cops. I found a file, Silas. Felix was keeping records. It's bad." I heard the flick of a lighter on the other end of the line, followed by a long exhale of smoke. "Where are you?" he asked. "The Shell station on Route 9. "Stay there," Silas said, his voice hard as iron. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't look at anyone. I'll be there in 10 minutes. And Cleo?" "Yes?" "If you have what I think you have, you just became the most dangerous woman in the county. Keep your head down." Silas Thorne drove a truck that looked like it had survived a war and sounded like it was dying of consumption. It was a rusted red beast that smelled of stale tobacco and pine needles. When he pulled up to the gas station curb, he didn't wave. He just leaned over and pushed the passenger door open. I climbed in and tossed my knitting bag onto the floorboard. Silas looked older than I remembered. His hair was pure white now, and his face was a map of deep lines etched by years of seeing things no one should have to see. But his eyes were the same, sharp and gray like chipped flint. "You weren't followed?" he asked, checking the mirrors. "I don't think so," I said. "I took the bus." I doubled back. He grunted in approval and peeled out onto the highway. We drove in silence for 20 minutes, leaving the town behind and heading up into the wooded hills where Silas lived in a small cabin that he claimed was for fishing, but I knew was for hiding. When we got inside, he locked the door with 3 separate deadbolts. He didn't offer me tea. He pointed to the kitchen table. "Show me," he said. I pulled the manila folder out of my bag, laid out the photos and the bank statements. Silas picked them up one by one. He put on a pair of reading glasses that looked comically small on his face and studied the documents. The silence stretched out for a long time. The only sound was the wind rattling the window panes and the hum of his refrigerator. Finally, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Felix was a brave man," Silas said softly. "Stupid, but brave. This is enough to put Desmond away for 20 years. Racketeering, extortion, fraud." "Then we take it to the police," I said. Silas shook his head. "Look at this signature on the bank transfer authorization. That's Captain Miller, the head of the precinct. Desmond didn't just buy the cops, Cleo. He bought the whole department. If we walk in there with this file, it will disappear, and so will we." I felt a cold stone settle in my stomach. "So what do we do? Do I just let him take my house?" "No," Silas said, standing up and pacing the small room. "We need leverage. We need him to confess to something the feds handle. Something local cops can't bury, like wire fraud or interstate trafficking." He stopped and looked at me. He wants that book, right? The Blackwood Ledger? Yes, I said. He tore my house apart looking for it. Does he know what it looks like? He knows it's old. He knows it's leather-bound, but he's never held it. Silas walked over to his own bookshelf. It was messy and crammed with paperback westerns and old manuals. He pulled out a thick book with a dark cover. It was a guide to fly tying from the 1950s. The cover was stained and cracked. We give him what he wants, Silas said. We set a meeting. Public place. I'll wire you up. We get him to admit he forged the deed to your house in exchange for the book. Once we have his voice on tape admitting to the forgery, we have him. He'll know it's a fake, I said, looking at the fishing book. Not from a distance, Silas said. And by the time he gets close enough to see the title, the trap will already be sprung. But you have to sell it, Cleo. You have to make him believe you are broken. Can you do that? I thought about my shredded books. I thought about Felix dying with this secret weighing on his heart. I thought about the way Desmond had looked at me like I was nothing more than a piece of furniture to be moved. I can do it, I said. Silas pushed his cell phone across the table. Call him. Tell him you want to trade. My hand trembled as I dialed the number. I remembered the haughty tone in Desmond's voice. I closed my eyes and summoned every ounce of grief and exhaustion I had felt over the last 3 months. I let my shoulders slump. I let my voice drop into a quaver. Desmond answered on the first ring. Mr. Galloway? I whispered into the phone. It's Cleo. Please stop. I can't take this anymore. Cleo, he said, and I could hear the smug satisfaction in his voice. I assume you are ready to be reasonable. I found the book, I lied, my eyes locked on Silas's face. I have the ledger. I just want my house back. I want you to tear up that loan agreement. If you bring the original deed, I will give you the book. A wise choice, Desmond purred. Where? The diner on 4th Street, I said. Tomorrow at noon. It's crowded. I don't want to be alone with you. Paranoid to the end, Desmond laughed. Very well, noon. Don't be late, Cleo, and bring the book, or the deal is off. I hung up the phone. My hands were steady now. The trembling was gone. I looked at Silas and nodded. The trap was set. The wire taped to my chest was itchy. It was a small black disc, cold against my skin, hidden beneath the layers of my wool cardigan and my high-collared blouse. Silas had secured it with medical tape in his kitchen, telling me to breathe normally and try not to sweat. That was easier said than done. Betty's diner was loud. It was the lunch rush, and the air was thick with the smell of frying bacon and burnt coffee. Dishes clattered, and waitresses shouted orders to the cooks. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting. Too much noise for eavesdroppers, but just enough chaos to make a man like Desmond Galloway uncomfortable. I sat in a corner booth facing the door. My hands were wrapped around a mug of tea to keep them from shaking. In my lap sat the decoy. It was Silas's old fly fishing manual wrapped in brown butcher paper and tied with a piece of twine. To anyone looking, it was just an old parcel. To Desmond, it was the keys to the kingdom. Silas was sitting in the booth directly behind me. We were back to back, separated only by the vinyl seat. I couldn't see him, but I could feel his presence. He had a receiver and a recorder tucked into his jacket. He was my shadow. At exactly noon, the bell above the door jingled. Desmond walked in. He looked ridiculous. In a sea of truckers in flannel and waitresses in pink uniforms, he stood out like a sore thumb in his charcoal Italian suit and silk tie. He scanned the room, his lip curling slightly in disgust at the grease and the noise. When his eyes landed on me, his expression shifted. He put on that mask of sympathetic concern again, the one that made my stomach turn. He walked over and slid into the booth opposite me. He didn't take off his coat. "Cleo," he said, leaning in. "You look tired." "I haven't slept," I said, keeping my voice low. "I just want this to be over, Desmond. I want my house back." "Of course," he said smoothly. He placed a briefcase on the table and clicked the latches open. He pulled out a single document. "This is the original loan agreement, the one with Felix's signature. If you give me the book, I will tear this up right now. The debt is canceled. The house is yours." I looked at the paper. I knew it was a forgery, but I needed him to say it. I needed him to say it loud enough for the microphone to catch it. "How can I trust you?" I asked. "Felix loved this house. He would never have signed it away. He told me he never took a loan." Desmond laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. He tapped his fingers on the table impatiently. "Felix was a stubborn old man, Cleo. He didn't know how the world worked anymore. He held on to things that didn't belong to him." "But the signature," I pressed, leaning closer to him. "It looks so real. How did you get him to sign it if he was in the hospital?" Desmond's eyes narrowed. He looked at the brown parcel in my lap. Greed was making him sloppy. He wanted the book so badly he forgot to be careful. "Does it matter?" he hissed, dropping his voice. "He's dead, Cleo. The past is dead." "It matters to me," I said. "I need to know. Did he betray me? Or did you fix it?" Desmond sighed, rolling his eyes. He looked around the diner. No one was paying attention to us. "Felix didn't sign it, Cleo. He was too weak to hold a pen. He was a fool who refused to do business, so I did it for him. I signed the paper. I filed the lien. It was necessary business. Now give me the damn book." My heart stopped. He had said it. I signed the paper. I felt a vibration against my back. Silas shifting in his seat. That was the signal. We had it. I slowly lifted the brown parcel from my lap and placed it on the table. Desmond's eyes went wide. He reached out his hands, trembling slightly with anticipation. "The Blackwood ledger?" he whispered. "Finally." "Tear up the loan first," I said, my voice suddenly hard. I wasn't acting anymore. Desmond sneered. He picked up the forged document and ripped it in half, then into quarters. He dropped the confetti onto the table. "There, you have your house. Now this is mine." He grabbed the parcel. He didn't wait. He ripped the twine off and tore the brown paper away. I held my breath. The cover was dark and leather-bound, just like the real one. But as soon as he opened it, he wouldn't see a map to gold. He would see diagrams of trout flies and fishing knots. Desmond flipped the cover open. He stared at the first page. Then he stared at me. The color drained from his face and was instantly replaced by a flush of violent red rage. "What is this?" he growled, holding up the diagram of a woolly bugger lure. "Is this a joke?" "No, Desmond," I said, sliding out of the booth. "It's a lesson. You should really check your sources." The noise in the diner seemed to vanish. The clatter of plates and the hum of conversation faded into a dull roar in my ears. All I could hear was the heavy, rasping breath of Desmond Galloway. He stood up slowly, and the vinyl booth squeaked in protest. His face was a mask of cold fury. The charm was gone. The politician was gone. All that was left was the predator. "You think this is funny?" he whispered. His voice was low, but it carried a violence that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You think you can play games with me, Cleo? I have buried people with more money and more power than you." He reached across the table and grabbed my wrist. His grip was painfully tight. His fingernails dug into my thin skin, and I gasped. "Where is it?" he hissed, leaning over the table so his face was inches from mine. "Where is the real book?" "Let go of her!" a voice boomed from behind him. Silas rose from his booth like a bear waking from hibernation. He didn't look like an old man anymore. He looked like the detective who had kicked down doors for 30 years. He clamped a heavy hand onto Desmond's shoulder and squeezed. I saw Desmond wince. "Sit down, Mr. Galloway," Silas said, "or I will put you through this table." Desmond looked at Silas, then at me. He released my wrist with a sneer and straightened his jacket. He didn't look afraid. That was what terrified me. He looked annoyed, like we were a minor inconvenience. "Silas Thorne," Desmond said, brushing his shoulder where Silas had touched him. "I heard you were still alive. Drinking yourself to death in the woods, I presume." "I'm alive enough to put you away," Silas said, stepping around the booth to stand next to me. He tapped his chest where the recorder was hidden. "We have it all on tape, Desmond. The forgery, the threats. You admitted to signing Felix's name." I expected Desmond to panic. I expected him to try and grab the recorder or run, but he didn't. He started to laugh. It was a dry, humorless sound that chilled me to the bone. "A tape?" Desmond shook his head, looking at us with pity. "You preserve the past, Cleo, but you clearly don't understand the present. By the time you get that tape to a judge, and by the time they authenticate it, and by the time they find a prosecutor brave enough to file charges against me, it will be next year." He checked his gold watch again. "And you don't have a year, Cleo. You don't even have an hour." "What do you mean?" I asked, clutching my purse. Desmond smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had already won the chess match 5 moves ago. "Did you think I came here without insurance? I knew you were up to something. While we have been chatting, my lawyer has been with the county sheriff. I filed an emergency motion for asset seizure based on the default of the loan. The sheriff is on his way to 42 Willow Creek Lane right now to padlock the doors and secure the contents of the house against theft." My blood ran cold. The ledger. "If the sheriff locks that house," Desmond said, leaning in, "no one goes in or out. Not even you. And once the property is in custody, my team will have supervised access to inventory the assets. I will find the book, Cleo, and I will find whatever else Felix hid. And you will be standing on the sidewalk, watching it happen." He buttoned his jacket and picked up his briefcase. "Enjoy your lunch," he said. "I believe they serve a wonderful humble pie." He turned and walked out of the diner, his heels clicking on the tile floor. I looked at Silas. His face was pale. "He's right," Silas said, grabbing my arm. "If the sheriff gets there first and puts a seal on the door, we can't break in. It becomes a crime scene. We have to beat him there." "The ledger is still in the kitchen," I whispered. "In the cookbook." "We have to go," Silas said, pulling me toward the door. "Now." We ran out to his truck, leaving cash on the table. The engine roared to life and Silas floored it. We careened out of the parking lot, tires screeching. We had to cross town in 15 minutes. And I knew Desmond wasn't just relying on the sheriff. He would have his own men waiting. Silas drove the old truck like he was 20 years old again. We flew down the highway, and the engine roared so loud it drowned out my thoughts. My hands were gripping the dashboard so hard my knuckles were white. I watched the speedometer climb past 80. "We have 5 minutes," Silas shouted over the noise. "If the sheriff sees us breaking into a sealed property, we go to jail. We have to be inside before he puts that notice on the door." "And if Desmond's men are already there?" I asked. "Then it gets messy," Silas said grimly. We turned onto Willow Creek Lane on 2 wheels. The tires screeched and left black marks on the pavement. I scanned the street. It was empty. The sheriff's cruiser wasn't there yet. But as we pulled into my driveway, I saw a gray sedan parked across the street. 2 men were sitting inside. They weren't police. They wore dark sunglasses and thick necks. Desmond's insurance policy. "Go to the back door," Silas commanded as he slammed the truck into park. "I'll watch the front. Get the book. Get the deed. Get everything." I scrambled out of the truck and ran. My legs felt heavy and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I fumbled with my keys at the back door. The lock stuck for a terrifying second before clicking open. I threw myself into the kitchen and locked the deadbolt behind me. The house was silent and still. It felt like holding your breath underwater. I ran to the counter. The art of French cooking was exactly where I had left it. I grabbed it and hugged it to my chest. It felt solid and real. The Blackwood ledger was safe. Next, I ran to the study. I needed the original deed. I had left it in the safe under the floorboards when I took the blackmail file yesterday. I fell to my knees and pried up the loose board. The safe was still there. I spun the dial. 1975. Click. I reached in and grabbed the thick parchment of the deed. It was the paper that proved this house belonged to the Prescotts, not to Galloway. Crash. The sound of shattering glass from the kitchen made me scream. I scrambled to my feet. I heard heavy boots crunching on the linoleum. The men from the sedan. They hadn't waited for the sheriff. They were breaking in. "Cleo!" Silas yelled from the front of the house. "Get in here!" I ran into the hallway, clutching the cookbook and the deed. Silas was dragging a heavy oak cabinet in front of the front door. He looked at me and pointed to the study. "In there!" he barked. "It's the only room with a solid door. Go!" We retreated into Felix's study. Silas slammed the heavy mahogany door shut and turned the brass lock. He jammed a chair under the handle just as a heavy weight slammed against it from the other side. The door shuddered, but it held. "Open up, Mrs. Prescott," a deep voice grunted from the hallway. "Mr. Galloway just wants his property." "It's not his property," I yelled back, my voice shaking with rage. "And the police are coming." "We'll be gone before they get here," the voice said. Another slam against the door. The wood splintered slightly around the lock. Silas pulled his revolver from his waistband. He didn't point it at the door. He held it at his side, his face calm and dangerous. "They won't get in," Silas said quietly. "But we can't get out." Outside, I heard the wail of a siren getting louder. The sheriff. We were trapped. If the sheriff found us barricaded in here with armed intruders, it would be chaos. And Desmond would spin the story. He would say, "We were the squatters." He would say, "We were the criminals." I looked at the desk. I looked at the ham radio equipment Felix used to keep in the corner. He had been an amateur operator chatting with people across the ocean on sleepless nights. The equipment was dusty, but the red power light was blinking. "Silas," I said, an idea forming in my mind. "We don't need to get out. We just need to get the truth out." I moved toward the radio. The banging on the door got louder. They were using a crowbar now. I could hear the wood groaning. I turned on the microphone. I wasn't going to call the police. I was going to call everyone. The wood around the lock splintered with a sickening crunch. The heavy oak door bowed inward, held only by the sturdy brass deadbolt and the chair Silas had jammed under the handle. Another blow slammed against it, shaking the framed diplomas on the walls. "They're not going to stop," Silas shouted, his shoulder pressed against the wood, his boots skidding on the Persian rug. "Cleo, whatever you're doing, do it fast." I rushed to the corner of the room where Felix's radio equipment sat like a dormant beast. It was a chaotic stack of black boxes, dials, and tangled wires. Felix had been a ham radio enthusiast for 40 years, claiming it was the only way to talk to the world without the internet filtering your words. I had always teased him about his spy gear. Now, it was my only lifeline. I flipped the master power switch. The equipment hummed to life, a constellation of amber and green lights blinking in the dim room. My hands were shaking, but my mind was racing through memories. Input to aux gain to 5, frequency modulation. I grabbed the auxiliary cable hanging from the console and jammed it into the headphone jack of Silas's digital recorder. "What are you doing?" Silas grunted as the door groaned again. A crowbar tip punched through the wood, inches from his head. He didn't flinch. "My niece," I said, my fingers flying over the dials. "Sarah, she's the producer for the midday news at WKRP. They take live caller tips. If I can patch this audio into their line..." I spun the large frequency dial. Static hissed through the speakers, loud and angry like frying bacon. I tuned it until the hiss cleared, and I heard the faint, tinny voice of the local news anchor discussing the weather. I grabbed the heavy microphone. I pressed the transmit button. The needle on the VU meter jumped into the red. "Sarah!" I shouted into the mic. "Sarah, it's Aunt Cleo. Listen to me." There was a crackle of silence, then a confused voice cut through the static. "Aunt Cleo? We are on air. How are you overriding the..." "Shut up and listen," I commanded. I had never spoken to her like that in my life. "I am playing a recording. Record it, broadcast it, do it now." I didn't wait for an answer. I hit play on Silas's device. The sound of Desmond Galloway's voice filled the study, amplified by the radio speakers. It was crisp and clear, stripped of the diner's background noise. "Felix didn't sign it, Cleo. He was too weak to hold a pen. I signed the paper. I filed the lien. It was necessary business." I watched the audio levels dance. The confession was going out. It was traveling through the wires, up the antenna on the roof, and beaming directly into the news station's receiver. From there, if Sarah did her job, it would be blasted into every car radio and kitchen in the county. Crack! The study door frame finally gave way. The wood shattered, and the door swung open violently, knocking the chair across the room. Silas stumbled back, raising his revolver. 2 men in dark jackets surged into the room. They were big, sweaty, and their eyes were fixed on the safe in the floor. "Drop it!" Silas roared, leveling his gun. The men hesitated, but it wasn't the gun that stopped them. It was the sound coming from outside. Through the broken window, over the wail of the sheriff's siren, we could hear another sound. A car parked on the street had its radio blaring, and from that car came a voice that was echoing through the neighborhood. "Sign the paper. I filed the lien." The goons froze. They heard it. They looked at the radio on the desk, then at me. "It's too late," I said, my voice trembling but loud. "The whole town knows. You're not recovering assets anymore. You're tampering with evidence." The men looked at each other. They were hired muscle, not martyrs. They knew the difference between a quiet eviction and a public scandal. Without a word, they turned and bolted back down the hallway, shoving past the arriving sheriff deputies. "Police!" A voice shouted from the front door. "Drop your weapons!" Silas slowly lowered his gun and placed it on the desk. He looked at me and grinned. It was a tired, grim smile, but it was real. "Nice work, Mrs. Prescott," he said. I slumped into Felix's chair, the microphone still clutched in my hand. The recording had ended. The airwaves were silent for a second. Then, the voice of the news anchor came back on, breathless and shocked. "Ladies and gentlemen, that was..." That appeared to be a recording of local developer Desmond Galloway admitting to fraud. We are trying to get clarification. The sheriff walked into the study. He was a heavy-set man with a red face. He looked at the shattered door, the open safe, and the old woman sitting by the radio. He looked confused. He had come here to arrest a squatter, but he had walked into a revolution. I stood up, smoothing my cardigan. I picked up the original deed from the desk. "Sheriff?" I said, holding the paper out like a shield. "I believe you have some questions for Mr. Galloway, and I believe the press is going to want to know why you are standing in my house." Sheriff Miller looked at the radio, then at the deed in my hand, and finally at Silas, who was leaning against the shattered doorframe with his arms crossed. The sheriff was a man who understood wind direction, and right now, the wind was blowing a hurricane of bad publicity straight into his face. The broadcast had changed everything. He couldn't drag an elderly widow out of her home in handcuffs after the whole county had just heard her accuser admit to a felony. "I need to see that deed, Mrs. Prescott," Miller said, his voice lacking its usual bluster. I handed it to him. He studied the paper, his flashlight cutting through the dust raised by the break-in. He traced the embossed seal of the county clerk from 40 years ago. It was real. It was undeniable. "This looks in order," he grunted. He keyed his radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch. Cancel the eviction order. We have a conflicting title situation." "And a confession," Silas added dryly. "Don't forget the confession, Miller." We walked out of the house not as prisoners, but as owners. The front yard was a circus. The red and blue lights of 3 patrol cars washed over the white siding of my home. But beyond the police tape, a news van had pulled up on the lawn. My niece, Sarah, was there, holding a microphone, her cameraman pointing his lens right at the driveway. And there, standing by his sleek black car, was Desmond Galloway. He looked like a man who had stepped off a ledge and hadn't hit the ground yet. He was furiously typing on his phone, trying to spin a narrative that had already spiraled out of his control. When he saw me, his face twisted. He started to walk toward me, ignoring the deputies. "This is a stunt," he shouted for the cameras. "That recording is a fabrication! This woman is senile and desperate!" I didn't flinch. I walked right up to the police tape. I held up the Blackwood ledger, the real one, in one hand, and the original deed in the other. "I am not senile, Desmond," I said, my voice steady and amplified by Sarah's microphone. "And I am not desperate. I am a librarian, and I know the difference between a copy and an original." I turned to the sheriff. "Mr. Galloway admitted to forging my husband's signature. He admitted to fraud. And I have the documents to prove that this house, and everything in it, belongs to the Prescott family." Desmond lunged forward, his composure shattering. "That book is mine! Felix promised it to me!" Sheriff Miller stepped in between us. He placed a heavy hand on Desmond's chest. The sheriff looked at the cameras, then at Desmond. He made a calculation. "Mr. Galloway," Miller said loudly, "I think you better come down to the station. We have some questions about that loan application." "You can't arrest me," Desmond sputtered. "I own half this town." "Not anymore," Silas said from behind me. I watched as the sheriff turned Desmond around and pulled his wrists behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was the most satisfying sound I had heard in months. Better than any book spine cracking. Better than any silence. As they shoved Desmond into the back of the cruiser, he locked eyes with me one last time. The arrogance was gone. All that was left was fear. 2 days later, I stood in the lobby of the county museum. The curator, a young man named Elias, wore white cotton gloves as I handed him the Blackwood ledger. "Are you sure, Mrs. Prescott?" he asked. "This book is worth a fortune. The rumor is it leads to gold." "It leads to trouble," I said, smiling. Jeremiah Blackwood's secrets destroyed his peace, and they almost destroyed mine. History belongs to everyone, Elias. Put it in a glass case. Let the children see it. But don't let anyone take it home. I walked back to Willow Creek Lane. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of grief. It was a peaceful silence. The books were back on the shelves. The floorboards were fixed. I made a cup of Earl Grey and sat in Felix's study. I looked at the photograph of him on the desk. He looked happy, caught mid-laugh. "We got him, Felix," I whispered. "The books are safe. I'm safe." I took a sip of tea and looked out the window at the garden. The sun was shining, casting long shadows across the grass. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was the keeper of the archives, and I was ready for whatever chapter came next. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Do you believe that some secrets should stay buried, or is the truth always worth the risk? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.